I think we can begin. If somebody comes later on, so he'll just join us. I think that today we're going to have a very interesting discussion with regards to GIPS standards. Have a lot of interesting people who deal with this business day to day, going to tell us a lot of interesting information. And before we begin, I'd like to give a word to Neil Withers, President of CFA Association Russia.
Thank you very much, Peter. And welcome. We're, as a representative of the CFA here, I'm really pleased that this event is happening. Performance measurement is something which can be slippery if there aren't the right standards. I did my CFA in Montreal many years ago, and the firm I was with was setting up a small fund, and we were saying, well, the owner of the fund put his money in here, and we got some money this month and next month, but the first 6 months were sort of the starting period, and we got a fair bit of money. How does it perform? I think we got a fair bit of money this month, though, which was actually the very bottom one. Let's start the performance measurement there. GIPS standards are absolutely necessary, and I'm very pleased that Peter is taking the initiative to lead that here in Russia. CFA Association itself has only been here for 10 years. We had our 10th anniversary celebration last fall. We now have 500 members of the CFA Russia Association, and there's actually about 600 people in Moscow who have earned their CFA. Not all of them continue to be members of the association. I'm very pleased. I think that's an essential sign of confidence in the future of finance, that if there are good professional people running the business makes sense to the clients, to the people with the money. And putting the investor first is an important concept of the CFA globally. Since the failure of the financial markets in 2008, we felt that some of it had to have been our fault. How, with 100,000 CFAs around the world, did we allow the financial markets to get so unbalanced? So we're trying hard to rectify that, to bring some better standards to the world. The GIPS standards, performance measurement for asset management, are not actually that old. They're 20-odd years. There have been previous people who struggled with this, but these now are standards very well accepted, and we're very pleased that they're coming here to Moscow. Iain, McAra, it's easy to say, but it doesn't look like it's how it's written. Is here from London. He is responsible for Europe, Middle East, and Africa for the CFA Institute on GIPS standards. We have colleagues from New York or Charlottesville, who are Ashland, who are one of the major firms who does the verification of performance measurement. And we have associates here who will be talking about how we've done this here in Russia. So I will turn that over now to Peter, who's been leading this initiative, to be moderator, and I hope you find this interesting. I hope that it's important to your clients, and therefore, because your clients end up knowing that you're honestly measuring performance, your reputation is better and you get more business. That's an essential part of this. Peter?
Thank you very much, indeed. So the basic strategy that we try to realize today is to take a look at the GIPS, first of all, generally, to understand what it is in simple terms and make it sort of applicable to Russian market. On the other side, we want to understand what has been the case studies in different countries around the world, what has been the trend in emerging markets in developed countries, to understand where the Russia fits currently. How is a GIPS incorporation into all the current money management firms possible? How is it probable? I think that it's important for us to understand what peculiarities exist here. Therefore, we have people who have led the GIPS incorporation into local money management firm, and then has been involved in GIPS incorporations for BNP Paribas some time ago. And of course, we're going to share the experience of our colleagues from Ashland, who's going to tell us a lot about their practice with regards to emerging markets. I say we just begin now, and I turn it over to you, Iain, please.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank Peter and I want to thank the CFA Society Russia for organizing this event and for inviting me along to talk about GIPS. It is an ethical standard. We have a few codes and standards that the CFA Institute supports and maintains. GIPS is one of those, Asset Manager Code is another, and then of course the individual code of practice that every charter holder would have to be adhering to as part of being granted the charter. So this, in terms of the CFA Institute, is a very important standard. So I'm going to briefly give you an overview of what it is. Okay, first and foremost, voluntary standards which govern the calculation and the presentation of historical investment performance based on ethical principles of fair representation and full disclosure. Now, this is how you would present performance to prospective clients. This has got nothing to do with what you present to your existing clients. That's up to you and them to decide. This is all about how you generate and present your track record to prospective clients, probably people with whom you don't have any form of communication beyond presenting information. So this is very, very important. From an ethical perspective, this is key in terms of presenting a full and fair picture of how you manage the various strategies that you are asking these people to buy into. On the next slide, you will see why we felt that these things were necessary 20 plus years ago. Now, the executive committee is the group that actually manages the GIPS. And the goal of the executive committee is to have all firms adopt the GIPS standards as the standard for investment firms to present historical investment performance information. So first and foremost, is it even worth thinking about getting involved with a standard if it's here today and gone tomorrow? This is not going to be gone tomorrow. This has already been around, certainly in the form of GIPS, since 2006, prior to GIPS, around since really the late 80s. And because it's a global standard, there were many other countries around the world who had some form of performance standard. But in coming towards GIPS in 2006, they gave up their own national standard and adopted GIPS as the standard that would be globally acceptable. We now have somewhere between 35 and 40 countries which actively support and promote GIPS. We used to say that this was a global passport. So wherever you were presenting into a country where there was a country sponsor, you knew the performance presentations generated under the GIPS standard were acceptable in those marketplaces. And the numbers of countries that are interested continues to increase. A brief statistic, rough, something I worked on last night, information that we're currently collecting indicates that there is about $23 trillion that is being managed under GIPS compliance. That is a pretty big number. That is roughly a third of the global assets that are being managed. So as to where we are now, a third of assets managed globally are being maintained to the GIPS standard. I think we can justifiably be proud of that. We've still got 2/3 that we need to chase, and we will definitely be doing that. So what's the mission? The mission of GIPS standards and the executive committee is to promote ethics and integrity and instill trust through the use of global investment performance standards by achieving universal demand for compliance by asset owners, so that's the investors, adoption by asset managers, and then support from the regulators for the ultimate benefit of the global investment community. This is all about ensuring the safety of investors. Because you have a full and fair and ethical way of presenting performance, you are not misleading anybody. And we wish to have that standard applied globally. That is the mission. think about that, that's the mission of the executive committee. If you or people that you work with are adopting these standards, they too are adopting that mission as well. That's a big ask, and it's a great aim to be going for. So why did we think performance standards were necessary? Well, we thought they were necessary because of people just like me. Okay? Look for the lowest point and start measuring from that point forward. No way, no way. There was a lack of reporting consistency. Well then, yes, there's an expiration on that then. But a lack of reporting consistency, okay? In some instances, back-testing information is used. Yes, hindsight is 20/20 when you're looking back. That's not allowed. Performance record portability, all sorts of ideas about who owned the performance, who's responsible for generating it. Is it the same team that was responsible now as was responsible when it was generated? Model portfolios, selecting individual portfolios and saying that represents your ability to manage to that strategy. Probably not the case. Survivorship bias. How many times do the funds that underperform and therefore are pulled from your management or the management get taken out of the track record because they're no longer there? Well, obviously you're going to have an upward drift in that instance. That's not allowed. Representative portfolio. Well, who in their right mind would select a representative portfolio that is not the best? I mean, you'd have to be an idiot. However, you're not meant to do that. That doesn't represent anything except your ability to select the best performing portfolio. Okay? What you want to be presenting to your prospective clients is your ability to manage a strategy. All the assets that are managed according to that strategy is what you should be presenting. And we'll get to how GIPS does that. So because there's all this variety of ways of reporting, there's a lack of comparability. If an individual wants to know, even knows what sort of product they're looking for or what type of fund they're looking for, long-term, money market, whatever, how do they know when they've got two managers that purport to manage the same thing exactly what information they're getting? How can they make a true comparison and make a real evaluation of that manager's ability? They can't unless there's some standard that they're following. The other point is there was a lack of guidance anywhere else. Now, as I said at the start, there were a number of countries that had their own style of performance standard, but there was very little uniformity across those different standards. Even when AIMR, as the CFA Institute was called, came out with its performance presentation standard, that was considered to be the US standard. AIMR PPS was given up, and the US adopted GIPS as the global standard because it was the global standard. So as much as the UK gave up their standard, the Swiss gave up their standard, so did the US, and everybody joined together and adopted GIPS as the global standard. There is a lack of regulatory guidance, not surprisingly. Regulators are interested in their own area that they regulate, national regulation. That is not going to necessarily address global applicability. So it's not surprising there's a lack of regulatory guidance, certainly on a global scale. But when you look at different markets, emerging, developing, and developed, there are different levels of guidance available in all those different areas. GIPS, being a global standard, can be applied in any market. Sometimes you will find that developing and emerging markets can actually embrace the idea of GIPS because they have no baggage or no heritage in terms of systems and processes and the way we've always done it that they have to get rid of. The idea that there is a standard out there that can be embraced and help move the industry forward in these emerging and developing areas is of real benefit. They don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's already something there that they can adopt and embrace. So the objectives of a standard are to ensure that there's accurate and consistent data, makes sense, worldwide acceptance of the single standard for calculating and presenting, and don't forget, calculations require decent input. We have a saying, garbage in, garbage out. You've got to have correct information to make the return that is generated valid in the first place. So not only calculating, but input. You want fair, global competition amongst the firms. We can promote industry self-regulation. Certainly within Europe, there are swathes of regulation going in there. It's debatable in some instances whether more regulation helps the industry or not. This is self-regulation. It's a voluntary standard. But if we want to be seen to be responding to the needs of the investors, we should embrace self-regulation. Otherwise, you tend to get what you deserve when a regulator could come in who isn't as tuned in to the requirements of the industry as maybe self-regulation allows them to be. Finally, the standard promotes investors' interests and instills in investors' confidence. You know, you're in this, the standards are in this for the long term. This is not a sort of, oh, this quarter we'll claim compliance with GIPS, next quarter we'll do something else. This is an investment, but an investment in something that promotes ethical behavior, in the end, in the long term, makes a stronger investment management community. It instills trust, and you get your investors engaged with you, and they know that they can trust you. It's not the only reason for doing it, to build trust, but it's a very good reason why these should be adopted. So what's the basics? How do we go about this standard? First and foremost, it's a claim of compliance that a firm makes, okay? Just as the individuals who are charter holders themselves individually have to comply with the code of conduct, here it is the firm that is claiming compliance. So it is a standard relating to ethical behavior that the firm is adhering and following to. So you will define what that firm is. Now, not to get into too many of the details, basically you could think of it as the way you hold yourself out to the public. Maybe it would be something like all assets managed in Moscow. That could be the definition of your entity. It's fairly easy to understand. It's self-explanatory what it is. So you define your entity and say, this is the thing that's going to claim compliance. Then you cast the net around all those assets that are managed in Moscow, and you take every single portfolio that is managed in Moscow, and you assign them to the different products that they are managed to, the strategies that are managed to. You can see where we're going here. We're getting everything that is managed in the same way, and we're aggregating it into a bucket. That is called a composite. And it's that performance that you present to your prospect. That's why it's full and fair. It's everything, mistakes and all. They're all in there. Every portfolio within the entity must be assigned to a strategy, even if you only have one fund, which is managed to a particular strategy. That is the composite for that strategy. That's fine. You then generate a certain amount of data, a certain amount of disclosures, and you present that to your prospective client. Always. You're not allowed to choose when you do, when you don't. A valid prospective client will receive that presentation. It needn't be only that, but it must be at least that, and that must come first or with everything else. This is why it's not misleading. You always present that. You describe the strategy with a combination of data and disclosure with that presentation. Now, here are some good benefits, and we'll get into more of these, for the investment manager. This track record that you're building up and presenting to prospective clients is built up of the actual portfolios that you're managing for existing clients. So all the policies and procedures and the consistency and the accuracy and the checking that you're doing to generate this performance presentation for your prospective clients is actually also going into supporting the information that you're generating for your existing clients. Even though the standards are all about presenting information to your prospects, the underlying data that is used to generate that is your existing clients' portfolios. So they are benefiting from the consistency and the controls that go behind the generation and the maintenance of GIPS compliance. So there's benefits there for your existing client base, not just the prospects who you're presenting to. So it's got to be actual data. You're not allowed to link hypothetical information. You can present hypothetically separately, but it can't be linked to actual. It's all about historical performance. It's not about expected returns. That's a whole different discussion. This is all about how you present past performance. And finally, and I'm sure that Stephen will dwell on this more, we have a concept, or we recommend a concept of verification. The claim of compliance is something that the manager makes. He does the work and he can say, I'm compliant, and you do it through a certain phrase, paragraph that you would present in the compliant presentation. However, it's recommended that an independent third party is used to ensure that the policies and procedures that you maintain are sufficient for you to be able to claim compliance. And then secondly, that you have assigned all the portfolios correctly into their buckets. And so your independent third party, the verifier, is engaged. It's recommended, it's not mandatory, it's recommended, is engaged to do that. Now, one thing I would want to also mention about that, particularly in an area where GIPS is maybe not so well known, you could use the knowledge that verifiers have as an additional tool to help you maintain compliance. Now, you have to be careful. The verifier is not allowed to check their own work. They have to be an independent third party. But they have huge amounts of knowledge. It would be very useful to engage a verifier and then make sure you have access to that knowledge so they can guide you and help you make your decisions. Don't just think of a verifier as somebody who comes in, ticks a load of boxes and says, yep, you're verified. They can be a real source of information, particularly where you do not have many people who are well versed in the details of GIPS. So, and I'm sure, again, our Ashland colleagues will be able to dwell on that a little bit. So that's a bit on verification. So let's go into the nitty-gritty, the nuts and bolts of the standards. There are some rules all about the fundamentals. It's a firm that's claiming compliance, not a piece of, not a composite, not a client, not a calculation. It's only the firm that can claim compliance. And it is a firm-wide ethical standard that you would be adhering to. So that's that. There are some provisions around input data, that it must be trade dated, that you must accrue for fixed income. You must apply cash flows in a way that is consistent. You can define what that is, but it must be applied consistently. You should follow the recommended valuation structure. This is very important. If you deviate from that hierarchy, that's fine. Disclose the fact that you deviate from the recommended valuation structure, but there is a valuation hierarchy included in GIPS that is recommended that it's followed. This is how you arrive at fair value for the assets that you're holding. It's very easy to come up with strained performance results if you mess around with where you're going to pick your valuations from, particularly for the less liquid assets. And again, in developing markets, there could be a significant proportion of those that are being held. So you need consistency in your approach to valuation. That consistency then provides fair asset values from which you then derive your returns. Calculation methodology. This is all about presenting the manager's ability to manage to a strategy. There are different ways of generating rates of return. Internal rates of return, time-weighted rates of return. GIPS is all about presenting time-weighted rates of return. Time-weighted rates of return remove the impact of cash flows that are controlled by the clients. Okay? You can significantly change a return by including the impact of cash flows. Time-weighted rates remove those. Therefore, you have a rate of return that is comparable between managers, even though they will have experienced different patterns of flows as they're eliminated. So that's your calculation methodology. Your composite construction is all about how you put the portfolios into the individual buckets, how you generate the aggregation, how you produce the return of the composite, the aggregate, as opposed to the individual portfolios. Then there's a load of disclosures that have to be put in there, and then there's a certain style of presentation and reporting. Briefly, when you first set out to claim compliance, your historical record that you must present is going to be the shorter of the previous 5 years or since inception. So obviously, if you've only been around managing assets for 2 years, you don't have a 5-year track record. That doesn't stop you claiming compliance. If you've been managing assets for 6 years, you suddenly decide you want to claim compliance, well, you have to go back and put the previous 5 years into the framework that supports GIPS compliance, okay? So you need to generate this back history. That back history then builds up to a mandated 10-year track record. So whenever you're presenting a strategy that has been managed for 10 years or more, you will present at a minimum 10 years of annual data. That is how you end up with a full and fair presentation of your ability to manage that strategy. We have additional standards around real estate, which is different from the sort of traditional assets, and also private equity. Because again, the ways you would manage that and the whole concept of what really constitutes a composite for private equity, venture capital, all of that is somewhat different. And then, just for the sake of completeness, RAP fee, which is a US-Japan type of concept, is also addressed separately. That's where you have a third party that is responsible for maintaining the books and records, let's say, it's a sort of mutual fund way of managing money. Then finally, verification. So those are the way that the GIPS standards are separated out. And you can see how we are getting into the consistency and the structure behind the information. So what are the benefits to investors and to intermediaries? Well, hopefully this is clear now. There's an enhanced ability to investors to compare performance between firms and strategies. You not only have to present the information, the returns and asset values and all the rest of it, but there need to be definitions associated with these strategies, these compliant presentations. The definition needs to have in it the basic characteristics of the strategy that you're presenting, references to the risks that are involved with this strategy. So you're not only presenting data, but you're also presenting a text around exactly what this strategy represents. So there is comparability between managers by looking at the definitions and the descriptions that they are supplying as well. So whilst you may get a much better performance record for a strategy that is given the same name, when you read the descriptions and you look at the risk descriptions that are in there, you can clearly see the enhanced performance has come from a greater level of risk. So there's comparability supplied through the presentation, not just through the data, but also through the disclosures. There's obviously got to be a consistency in the calculation and how you present the information, the frequency of valuations, which is monthly as a minimum, and I've mentioned already treatments of large cash flows, and full disclosure on important details, significant events, fees. Is there been a change in the management structure that is responsible for this strategy? The whole portability thing, that is there as well. The investors and the intermediaries will receive that information. Intermediaries, consultants, can then take that as done. They can then concentrate on adding value beyond what the standards has said must be supplied to them. So you're really getting from the consultants the added value that they're meant to be doing. They're not worried about why doesn't this data reconcile to the previous one? How come you're presenting such and such and they're presenting this? Why doesn't it all tally up together? That's all been done. That's how you're getting a full and fair set of information. Benefits to investment managers, they're actually huge. It goes way beyond just being able to say, oh, I claim compliance with GIPS, it's a global ethical standard, aren't I good? A lot of firms, particularly in the emerging markets, are adopting these standards because they help them to have a tight process. Because you've got to go in and look at the information, look at the input data, look at the way you're doing valuations, look at the way you're assigning portfolios, look at the dispersion in a composite for portfolios that are supposedly being managed the same, you suddenly get back a huge amount of information about how you're actually running the money in your business. Because this is a structured approach to presenting the information about everything that you're actively managing. You can use that input within your own firm to ensure you have a tight process. Part of GIPS is also policies and procedures. You have to document the policies and procedures that underlie everything that you're controlling around the GIPS process in order to maintain compliance. That is not only an excellent document for business recovery, for accident recovery, for training your own staff. It's a complete record of how things have been done within your organization, so that if and when errors occur, and let's face it, there's so much data flowing through the majority of asset managers, errors do crop up. You can work out exactly what's being done, how to eliminate those errors, what additional controls or processes need to be in place, you document it, and you know how to go ahead. It's a real tight control of back office, so the accounting functions, and middle office, also the way you present information to prospects. How many times have people within the sales team come back and said, well, client XYZ received this, or prospective client received this the other time we went to see them. And somebody looks at it and says, well, where did that come from? And you spend 3 or 4 days trying to work out what on earth it was. You can't replicate it. You don't know what exchange rates you used. You have no idea what the valuations were. So then they get into a discussion with this prospect about why what they're showing them now doesn't reconcile, and you've lost the business. Here you have a complete, consistent approach to the way the information is presented and pitched and put out in the compliant presentation. It is consistent, it reconciles period to period. Go past all of that messing around with what the numbers mean and talk about your processes and your investment strategies, knowing the numbers are secure. That is a huge benefit to investment managers. You've got transparency to the performance presentation, which gives an improved view of the track record, because it has to have a minimum amount of information to start with, including benchmarks, dispersion, and a certain number of years. There is transparency. You're not picking your time frames, you're not picking a start point. It's all there. No product outperforms the market consistently. There are always cycles, and you can discuss in an informed way why in certain times you've underperformed and enjoy the fact that in other times you outperform, knowing that your prospect understands that you're not gaming the data, you're following a standard, and this is the full and fair presentation. Now, the other reason that you might wish to adopt this is, as I said, there's somewhere between 35 and 40 countries which are already country sponsors for GIPS. There are asset management firms outside of those countries which are also claiming compliance with GIPS. We can demonstrate that there is somewhere between $25 trillion that are already being managed in a compliant framework. So it is a big, big concept that is out there. It's not going away. The Institute and the country sponsors are fully committed to the life of GIPS and GIPS remaining. So this is just a picture of the status of GIPS adoption. We're adding countries regularly. Nigeria has just come on board as a country sponsor. Cyprus has come on as a country sponsor. We're having in-depth discussions with the Middle East. We have a number of other countries that are interested. So this just shows you how it's going. That's not to say there's not a lot still to do. Of course there is. But it is very, very well established. And this is the governance structure. How do all these country sponsors actually interact with the standards? Well, you can see we have a technical committee, and all the representatives of the different countries attend individual regional technical committees. This is very important. If this is a global standard, it has to be relevant globally. We need the feedback from these individual countries to ensure that as the standards develop, and they do, they're not a ossified, a set-in-stone concept. They are continually embracing changes that occur in the marketplace. Very recently, we issued a guidance statement on dealing with alternative assets, because there's a lot of development, particularly during the global financial crisis, to do with side pockets and derivatives and all those sort of valuations. We embrace those with the standards. We make sure the standards reflect the developments of the industry. And we have ways of introducing these improvements through questions and answers and things called guidance statements. So the actual written text itself is always getting relevant and made relevant to what is happening in the industry. It is key for us to have the input from the individual countries to enable us to stay up to date and to ensure it's addressing their issues as well as being a global standard. Finally, we offer a number of resources so that people can actively go out there and learn about this themselves. Okay, we have a standards website of many, many pages. We have guidance statements. We have Q&A database where you can search on a variety of questions. We issue webcasts, which are available through the CFA Institute websites, which are free. A handbook itself, it's 450 odd pages, but that's a huge amount of discussion. The standards are 80 pages. The discussion and the help and all of that is another 380. It's well worthwhile, trust me. We also have a help desk. Anyone can send a question concerning GIPS to the help desk, and it is turned around within 3 days. So specific individual problems or thoughts or questions will be answered by highly knowledgeable individuals who deal with GIPS. So there is an excellent resource that should be used. We have an alert list where people sign up to that and they will receive all the updated information about GIPS. We have a Twitter feed, and finally CIPM, which, as you may be aware, is a designation that the CFA Institute supports. Around 25% of that designation specifically addresses GIPS. It goes far beyond that in terms of how you might use that information, but roughly 25% of the examination of the reading material is to do with GIPS. So hopefully that's a big picture overview.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. That's very specific at the same time, very understandable explanation. I have a few follow-up questions to GIPS. I was just listening carefully and thinking whether to comply with GIPS, whether to spend resources, time, money, and so forth. They need to understand how exactly they will use it and what for they will use it. Now, from what you've said, I understand that first of all, it is convenient. Okay, convenient is good. How can we make money out of it? How can we make more clients, more assets under management? Is this something that firms, all over the world use a brand name as a marketing tool and say, listen, you can trust us. We are GIPS, basically, right? You cannot trust those guys around the corner because we don't know how they manage to calculate the performance wherever it is, right? Is this the key selling point, or is it just convenient and that's it? Because what's major?
Okay. There are very specific ways that you can represent the fact that you are claiming GIPS compliance. It is, after all, a trademark, and they are very carefully protected. So there are very specific ways you can state the fact that you are GIPS compliant, or you can advertise the fact. We actually have advertising guidelines within the GIPS standards indicating how you can represent in an advertisement that you are GIPS compliant. There are many reasons why a manager might actually consider the fact that they should pursue GIPS compliance. Consider this first. There's nothing I've spoken about here, apart from the structure, that you're not doing already as part of producing information either to market yourselves to prospects or to support your existing clients. You've all got to do valuations. You've all got to measure and generate returns. You all produce some form of marketing information, whatever it might be. There's all sorts of things you do. All GIPS does is tell you the way you should go about it specifically. And none of what it's really telling you to do is that difficult, okay? You trade date your purchases and sales. Fine, probably everybody's already doing that. You measure your returns on a monthly basis. You do your valuations at the close of business, the last business day of the month. Okay, well, not a big deal either. All these things you're already doing, but you're just possibly not doing them in a cohesive, holistic way. What the GIPS standards are doing is putting in place a framework under which you do all these different things. So the idea that maybe it's an additional cost. Some things potentially are an additional cost. The idea that you are recommended to do a verification, you don't do verification of other things, you do assurances. You've got accountants crawling all over your firm doing assurances. This is just another assurance, in effect. You do have to generate composites, but that is a way of presenting your performance in a full and fair fashion. So rather than just having random ways of doing things, you're actually following a framework. The costs, whether you do it randomly, whether you do it under the framework, are pretty much the same. Don't think of it as an incremental cost. It's just realigning the costs that you're already spending on doing something in a structured framework. So that's one thing. Another thing in terms of some managers believe that there is a marketing advantage to being able to say that they claim compliance with GIPS. Okay? In developed markets, there is definitely requests from investors, are you claiming compliance with GIPS? In requests for proposals, that is a question that is asked. I think, and Stephen may know this better than I do, it's somewhere around 87% of respondees. I'll have to think about this. There is a significant proportion of people who are wanting to state in RFPs that they claim compliance with GIPS. They understand the value of the fact that they pursue the GIPS framework, and that has value to the investors. So from that perspective, there is a marketing, it's really now a marketing disadvantage. If you can't say yes, you're at a disadvantage, yes.
Okay.
Again, the idea that you are holding yourself out, particularly in this industry, as maintaining an ethical framework, an ethical way of working that puts investors up front is, mercifully, for some people, a benefit. It is something they actually want to proudly proclaim. And GIPS is one way of stating that, as is saying that they follow the asset management code, another way of doing that. So actually, putting yourself out there as a firm that believes in an ethical framework under which to do business is beneficial. In the long term, we firmly believe that firms that do right by their investors are the ones that will survive the best. When everything's going fine, nobody cares. It's when you've got to justify your existence that if you can show that you have been following an ethical pathway, that is a much easier discussion to be had.
What about a trend with regards to this GIPS usage in emerging markets? Is it, increasing? Where do we see the greatest growth rates? And what's the reason for this, really? Because is it something that Russia just goes along with everybody from emerging markets?
No.
Oh.
Very interesting. I mean, emerging markets, there's a lot of regionalization that's going on. There is a lot of countries where domestic managers understand that global managers are coming into their turf. Global managers clearly are already claiming compliance with GIPS in some instances. Somewhere there's $23 trillion that's being managed under that sort of framework. So nationally, asset managers are aware that firms that claim compliance are starting to come into their arena. So in order to just compete with that, it's something that they should be looking at adopting. The other thing is that it's a global standard. So if they themselves want to, at some point, develop beyond their national boundaries, being able to say that they have information that is generated and maintained under this framework means that they have a passport where they can use that information in the other areas where they may also wish to compete. In addition, with regionalization, where there is a increased flow of assets across borders and the borders are lowered down, whilst that is good in terms of giving them access to other markets, regulators in those other markets may well take a stronger view in terms of what those outside managers are presenting in their own markets. If those managers can demonstrably show that they are following some form of global standard, particularly if the regulator in that country is aware of that standard, and not only that, but actually likes it, endorses it, that's to those managers' advantages as well in the emerging regions. It's different in the developed markets. In the developed markets, there is so much regulation which they already have to follow and already have to comply with. To differentiate why GIPS adds value can sometimes be difficult. But again, in a lot of instances, it's not so much that, oh, it's just another thing we have to do. If they really looked hard at what they were actually having to do anyway, they would find that without many changes, they could also see that they could maintain a GIPS framework and claim compliance. So it's a slightly different concept between developed and developing and emerging.
Well, we have far way to go there. Well, yeah, good thing that we're starting this, at least. So, yeah. Well, yeah, sure.
That's an excellent question. It is voluntary. But when you make a claim of compliance, you are marketing yourself, you're advertising yourself in some way. So a classic market to think about is the US. The SEC does not endorse GIPS. However, what they say is, when somebody states that they are GIPS compliant, they are advertising someone. And they have actually been trained by GIPS staff as to things they should look for when examining the idea that someone's claiming compliance. And they will sanction a manager because they know that the claim that they are making is a misleading advertisement, because they know that they are not, even at some basic level, actually compliant with GIPS. So from that instance...
The rule is you can't advertise properly.
Exactly.
GIPS and you're not doing GIPS.
Exactly, exactly, yes. And that's the approach they take. Other regulators are very interested in supporting the standard in their region, or in their country, and so they will actively promote the idea that. But we would actually discourage a regulator from adopting the standard as their own, because it's a global standard. And at some point, what they need to do nationally may not be what is necessary from a global perspective. Now, within the standards, we have a provision that allows people who are operating under a regulation which deviates from GIPS to disclose the fact that they are not doing a certain thing that is required by GIPS because their regulator requires them to do something else. So they can still comply with GIPS, even though following the regulation means they can't do a certain thing, but they need to disclose that. So we're actually able to accommodate national differences under the global standard.
Adopting IFRS, all banks, but our own version.
Well, what we want to do is retain the standard because you disclose precisely why you deviate. So therefore you can make the comparisons.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed.